Frederick's mother was a fleeting presence in his life. Harriet Bailey worked on a distant plantation, and the brutal demands of slavery kept mother and child apart. Douglass remembered seeing her only a handful of times before her death, which came when he was about 7 years old. Their rare meetings were brief and shrouded in darkness, for Harriet would walk miles at night to see her son, only to leave again before dawn. These nocturnal visits were the only warmth he knew from her, and when she was gone, the loss was profound but expected, a sorrow woven into the very fabric of enslaved life. In the absence of his mother, Frederick was raised by his maternal grandmother, Betsy Bailey. Grandmothers in the enslaved community often filled the gaps left by separated families, offering what comfort they could, though even this was subject to the whims of their enslavers. For Frederick, his grandmother's care was his first experience of stability, but it was a stability forever threatened by the system that owned them both. As soon as he was old enough to be of use, his childhood was abruptly ended. At the age of 6, Frederick was sent away from the small cabin he had known and carried to the main plantation. The separation from his grandmother was not just physical but a psychic wound, a lesson in the disposability of enslaved lives. On the White House plantation, and later at other properties, Frederick entered a world governed by violence and fear. The plantation system in Maryland was built on the backs of the enslaved, their labor feeding the prosperity of others. Tobacco was the chief crop, and the fields required not just strength but endless hours under the sun, watched by overseers whose authority was absolute. The city of Baltimore marked a profound turning point in Frederick Douglass's life. At 8 years old, after spending 2 years on the main plantation following his departure from his grandmother's cabin at age 6, he was sent away from the rural world he had known and delivered into the household of Hugh and Sophia Old. In that bustling port city, the air felt different, thick with the smells of shipyards and promise, yet still shadowed by the ever-present reality of slavery. For Douglass, Baltimore was not simply a change of scenery, it was the unlikely site of his first taste of true possibility. Sophia Auld, his new mistress, was unlike any white woman Douglass had previously encountered. In the early days of his arrival, her manner was gentle, even maternal. She began, with apparent innocence, to teach him the alphabet. To young Frederick, the shapes and sounds of letters opened a door he had not even known existed. But this fragile opportunity did not last. When Hugh Auld discovered his wife's lessons, he intervened with forceful clarity. Teaching an enslaved boy to read, he declared, would ruin him, making him unfit for slavery and impossible to control. The lesson was abruptly cut short, but the words lingered in Douglass's mind long after. It was in that moment, he would later recall, that he understood literacy was a pathway to power and that those who enslaved him feared it for exactly that reason. Denied formal instruction, Douglass's hunger for knowledge only grew. He resolved to teach himself, though he knew such a pursuit was fraught with danger. In defiance of the Aulds' prohibition, he transformed the bustling streets and docks of Baltimore into his clandestine classroom. Douglass devised a simple but ingenious plan. He would trade bread, a precious commodity in his world, to poor white children in exchange for reading lessons. These street-corner tutors, often themselves on the margins of society, became his accomplices in a quiet revolution. With scraps of newspaper and battered schoolbooks, Douglass pieced together the mysteries of the written word. He read whenever and wherever he could, studying old copies of the Columbian Orator and discarded newsprint, poring over whatever fragments fell into his hands. The Columbian Orator, purchased with painstakingly saved coins at the age of 12, became both a talisman and a teacher. The book contained essays, speeches, and dialogues drawn from Enlightenment thinkers and orators. In those pages, Douglass encountered arguments for human rights and the power of eloquence to persuade and to liberate. The dialogues between master and slave, the appeals to justice and reason, resonated deeply with him. They showed him that the struggle for freedom was not only possible but righteous, and that words could be wielded as weapons against oppression. Douglass's quest for literacy was not a solitary one. As his confidence grew, so did his sense of responsibility to others. He began to teach fellow enslaved people to read and write, gathering small groups in secret, sometimes in the afternoon hush of a Sabbath day. These lessons were acts of defiance, punishable by brutal retribution. Yet for Douglass, the risk was outweighed by the hope of collective uplift. Each letter learned, each word deciphered, was a blow struck against the chains that bound them all. Teaching others became a form of resistance, a way to kindle the flame of liberty in hearts that the system of slavery sought to keep in darkness. But the shadow of danger was never far. At 15, Douglass was abruptly returned to the Eastern Shore, a move that tore him from the relative freedom of Baltimore and thrust him back into the harsh reality of plantation life. There, he came under the control of Edward Covey, a man notorious for his cruelty, a slave breaker, known for his talent at subduing rebellious spirits. Covey's methods were relentless: beatings, humiliation, and psychological torment designed to crush the will. For months, Douglass endured this violence, his body and spirit battered by the daily struggle. Yet something within him refused to yield. The memory of letters and words, the lessons of the Columbian Orator, sustained him. The pivotal moment came when Douglass, after a particularly brutal attack, resolved to fight back. In the ensuing confrontation, he resisted Covey physically, a dangerous gamble that carried the risk of death or worse. To Douglass's astonishment, Covey did not pursue further retribution. That act of resistance marked a turning point. It was as if, in standing up to Covey, Douglass had reclaimed a measure of his own humanity. He would later reflect that from that day forward, he felt himself a slave in form only, not in spirit. Escape, which had once seemed a distant dream, gradually became an imperative. Douglass began to plot his freedom, testing the limits of both his courage and his cunning. In 1836, he and a small group of friends hatched a plan to flee northward. The attempt failed, and Douglass was captured and jailed. It was a perilous moment. Many in his situation would have been sold south, condemned to the even harsher conditions of the Deep South plantations. But Douglass was instead returned to Baltimore, a stroke of fate that opened a new window of opportunity. Back in Baltimore, Douglass did not abandon his quest. Instead, he deepened his resolve, nurturing alliances and quietly gathering the resources he needed. Among the most crucial of these was Anna Murray, a free black woman whose steadfast support would prove instrumental. Anna provided Douglass with encouragement, money, and a sense of hope that transcended their circumstances. Together, they planned his escape with meticulous care. In 1838, cloaked in the borrowed uniform of a sailor and armed with papers and money from Anna, Douglass embarked on the most hazardous journey of his life. He traveled by train, moving swiftly and silently through stations where discovery would mean certain ruin. The journey from Baltimore to New York City took less than 24 hours, but each minute carried the weight of years. When Douglass arrived in New York, he was at last a free man, though the danger of recapture lingered. Freedom brought new challenges, but also new beginnings. Douglass and Anna Murray were married soon after his arrival in New York. They settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they adopted the surname Douglass, a symbolic break from the past and a step towards self-definition. In New Bedford, Douglass discovered a vibrant, free black community and the dignity of paid labor, experiences that would inform his evolving vision of equality. Throughout his life, Douglass would return to these early chapters: his defiance in the face of illiteracy, his resistance to Covey, his daring escape as sources of inspiration, and as themes in his powerful autobiographies and speeches. The risks he took: learning to read in secret, teaching others under threat of violence, and orchestrating his own flight to freedom, reveal a resilience that would come to define his public life. Douglass's journey from bondage to liberty was not merely a personal triumph. It was a testament to the indomitable will to be free and to the conviction that knowledge is, in itself, a form of emancipation. In the bustling port town of New Bedford, where the salty air mingled with hope and hard labor, Frederick Douglass found a new beginning, not just for himself, but soon enough for an entire movement. No longer forced to look over his shoulder at every footstep, Douglass settled into life as a free man with gratitude and wonder. Yet, in quiet moments, memories of bondage pressed at the edges of his mind, refusing to fade. The past, with all its cruelty and injustice, seemed to demand a voice. And so, Douglass listened to that call. He began attending abolitionist meetings, often sitting quietly at first, absorbing the arguments and outrage that filled the rooms. But Douglass was not content to remain a silent witness. At one of these gatherings, he stood and spoke, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence about the realities of slavery as only someone who had survived it could. His words painted vivid scenes of deprivation and resilience, and those in attendance quickly recognized the authenticity and urgency in his voice. It was not long before word spread of this remarkable young man, whose oratory could silence a crowded hall and move even the most hardened hearts. The turning point came in the summer of 1841 on the island of Nantucket, at a convention of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Douglass, still uncertain of his place among established white reformers, was invited to address the gathering. As he rose to speak, the room quieted. What followed was no ordinary speech. Douglass recounted his experiences in bondage with searing honesty, making palpable the pain, longing, and hope that shaped his years in slavery. His eloquence astonished the crowd. Among those moved were William Lloyd Garrison and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, leaders in the struggle for abolition and women's rights, who saw in Douglass the living embodiment of the cause. From that moment, Douglass's rise was meteoric. Garrison and his colleagues persuaded him to join the abolitionist lecture circuit, and soon he was traveling throughout the North, speaking to audiences that ranged from curious townsfolk to skeptical critics. His appearance, a tall, dignified black man with a commanding presence and resonant voice, challenged listeners' deepest assumptions. Many in his audience had never before heard a black man speak with such fluency, intellect, and force. Douglass's every word undermined the racist arguments that claimed black people were intellectually inferior or incapable of reasoned thought. Yet, with acclaim came skepticism. Some found it hard to believe that someone who had been enslaved could be so articulate and learned. Whispers circulated that Douglass must be an imposter, that his story was too compelling to be true. Rather than shrink from this challenge, Douglass met it head-on. He realized that to silence the doubters and to expose the horrors he had endured, he would have to commit his story to paper. In 1845, he published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Written with directness and power, the book recounted his journey from bondage to freedom in unflinching detail. It was a sensation, selling thousands of copies and becoming one of the most influential abolitionist texts of its time. The narrative was more than a personal memoir, it was an indictment of the nation's conscience. Douglass's descriptions of violence, deprivation, and the systematic destruction of families left readers unable to ignore the brutality at the heart of American society. His words exposed not only the physical cruelties of slavery, but also the hypocrisy of a nation that proclaimed liberty as its highest ideal while denying it to millions. By laying bare his own scars, Douglass forced his readers to confront the true nature of the system they tolerated and to see, in his journey, the possibility of transformation. With fame came new dangers. The publication of his autobiography risked exposing Douglass's whereabouts to those who might wish to return him to slavery. Nevertheless, he pressed on with his activism, undeterred by threats or fatigue. He became a full-time lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, traveling from town to town, often facing hostile crowds. At times, Douglass encountered open discrimination and even violence. He was spat upon, jeered, and, in some towns, chased from the stage. The grueling schedule left him exhausted, but the injustice he faced only strengthened his resolve. Douglass's oratory was renowned for its versatility and emotional power. He could thunder against injustice, drawing upon his own experiences to make abstract principles immediate and real. Yet he could also speak with gentleness and humor, meeting his audiences where they were and leading them, step by step, toward empathy and understanding. Over the years, Douglass delivered more than 2,000 speeches, each one a testament to his stamina and dedication. He was not merely a witness to history, but an agent of change, using his voice as both sword and shield. But Douglass's activism did not end with his own experience, nor was it limited to abolition. He saw clearly that the fight for freedom was incomplete if it excluded women. In 1848, Douglass attended the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights gathering in the United States. He rose to speak in support of women's suffrage, arguing that justice demanded the ballot for all, regardless of gender or race. His presence at Seneca Falls was not merely symbolic, it was a declaration that the struggle for equality was indivisible. Whether advocating for the end of slavery or for women's rights, Douglass always returned to the central principle of human dignity. As Douglass's influence grew, he sought new ways to reach the public. In 1847, he founded his own newspaper, the North Star, which quickly became a leading voice for abolition and reform. Through its pages, Douglass championed not only the freedom of enslaved people, but also the broader cause of social justice. His pen, like his voice, was sharp and unyielding. He challenged his readers to act, to question, and to dream of a nation more true to its founding ideals. The North Star became a beacon for reformers across the country and abroad, further cementing Douglass's place at the center of the abolitionist movement. Douglass's speeches became legendary, none more so than his address, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." In this powerful oration, Douglass laid bare the contradictions of American liberty, denouncing the celebration of independence while millions remained in chains. The speech did not merely condemn. It demanded that Americans reckon with the gap between their professed values and their realities. In Douglass's words, the nation heard both rebuke and hope, a call to align its practices with its promises. Through relentless activism, Douglass became not only a leading figure in the American abolitionist movement, but also an international symbol of resistance to oppression. His publications circulated on both sides of the Atlantic, and his example inspired reformers far beyond the borders of the United States. The publication of further autobiographies, My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855 and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass in 1881 and 1892 allowed him to revisit and deepen his reflections, providing successive generations with a first-hand account of slavery, resistance, and transformation. Yet Douglass's journey was never easy. The path he walked was marked by skepticism, danger, and the constant burden of representing a people denied their voice. Each time he stood before a hostile crowd or took up his pen against injustice, he risked more than his reputation. He risked his safety and his very freedom. Still, he pressed onward, convinced that the truth, once spoken, could not be silenced. In every speech, every article, every act of defiance, Frederick Douglass became a voice for the voiceless. He transformed his pain into power and his story into a weapon against oppression. Through eloquence and courage, he forced a divided nation to confront itself, and in doing so, he charted a course toward a more just and inclusive future. In the years following the Civil War, Frederick Douglass's journey did not slow. Instead, his life entered a new phase, one shaped by his hard-won status as statesman, advisor, and relentless advocate for justice. The abolition of slavery, a cause to which he had devoted so much energy and intellect, did not mark an endpoint for Douglass. Rather, it presented new and urgent challenges as newly freed people navigated a nation struggling to define what freedom and equality would truly mean. Douglass understood, perhaps more than any of his contemporaries, that the struggle for civil rights was not merely a battle over laws or decrees, but a contest for the very soul of the nation. As the smoke of war cleared, Douglass remained at the forefront of public life. He drew upon the authority he had earned as a witness to slavery and as a voice for its abolition to press for a broader vision of justice. Douglass's advocacy did not narrow after emancipation, it expanded. He saw clearly that the promises of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, would be hollow unless Black Americans could claim the rights of full citizenship, protection under the law, and the dignity of the ballot. His determination to see these promises fulfilled brought him into direct conversation, and sometimes debate, with the nation's highest office holders. Douglass did not shy away from challenging presidents when he believed the cause of justice demanded it, nor did he hesitate to offer counsel when it might further the progress of Black equality. Public office was, for Douglass, both a platform and a proving ground. He broke barriers repeatedly, accepting appointments that had previously been the exclusive domain of white men. As United States Marshal for the District of Columbia and later as Recorder of Deeds for the city, Douglass became one of the most prominent Black officials in the federal government. Each appointment was a tangible, if sometimes controversial, step toward the vision of equality he championed. Crowning his diplomatic career, Douglass was named Minister Resident and Consul General to Haiti, a post that placed him at the intersection of American and Caribbean politics and offered symbolic recognition of his stature as an international statesman. In these roles, Douglass navigated complex political realities, often facing skepticism or outright hostility from those who questioned the ability or right of a Black man to serve in such capacity. Yet, by occupying these offices with dignity and diligence, Douglass helped redefine the possibilities for Black Americans in public life. The breadth of Douglass's commitment was perhaps nowhere more evident than in his embrace of universal suffrage and equality. Even as he worked to secure the rights of formerly enslaved people, Douglass stood with the growing movement for women's suffrage. He believed that the cause of women's rights and the cause of Black rights were indivisible, a conviction that placed him among the rare voices who saw beyond the segregated struggles of their time. In fact, Douglass's reputation as a champion for equal rights was so pronounced that he was nominated, without his consent, as the first African-American candidate for Vice President of the United States on the Equal Rights Party ticket. While he did not seek the office, the very fact of his nomination spoke to the reach and resonance of his advocacy. The aftermath of war and the tumult of Reconstruction exposed the limits of legal victories. Douglass recognized that changing the law was not enough. The nation's conscience had to be moved and its habits remade. He remained a powerful presence on the lecture circuit, challenging complacency and calling the country to higher ground. His speeches during this period made it clear that freedom, without justice and opportunity, was only half a victory. Douglass urged his listeners to reckon with the unfinished business of democracy and to extend its blessings to all, regardless of race or gender. Douglass's later years were marked not only by public roles and speeches, but by the steady presence of his family, especially his wife Anna Murray Douglass and their children. Anna, who had been a steadfast partner from the earliest days of his escape to freedom, managed the household and provided vital support for his activism, even as she preferred life away from the spotlight. Their children, too, played important roles in managing family affairs and supporting Douglass's projects. The Douglass home became a place of both refuge and activity, a center of family life, political discussion, and, ultimately, a living monument to the values Douglass espoused. As the years passed, Douglass's influence grew even as his hair whitened and his steps slowed. He continued to advise presidents, including during the difficult years when political will for Reconstruction faded and violence against Black Americans surged. Though the national mood often swung toward retreat and compromise, Douglass's voice remained clear, unsparing, and insistent that justice could not wait. He did not only look inward to the challenges facing Black Americans, he engaged with international questions, as in his diplomatic service to Haiti, reflecting his understanding that the struggle for equality was not confined by borders. Douglass's legacy did not reside solely in the offices he held or the speeches he delivered. It was enshrined in his prolific writings, his autobiographies, essays, and letters that chronicled not only his life, but the aspirations and disappointments of a nation in transition. These writings, preserved and studied for generations, offer a window into both the personal journey of Douglass and the broader sweep of American history. His home at Cedar Hill in Washington, District of Columbia, where he spent his final years, stands today as a testament to a life lived in pursuit of justice. A place where visitors can imagine the man writing late into the night or receiving guests both humble and renowned. Perhaps the clearest measure of Douglass's enduring impact is how his image and words continue to inspire. His life story, once invoked as proof of the possibility of uplift and transformation, has become a touchstone for movements seeking justice and equality. Each February, during Black History Month, schools and communities across the United States return to Douglass's writings, seeking guidance and inspiration in a voice that still resonates. His challenge to the nation, to include those long excluded from the American ideal of the self-made man, remains pointedly relevant. Douglass never accepted that greatness was the preserve of the privileged or the powerful. He insisted that dignity and achievement could belong to all, regardless of birth or circumstance. The preservation and study of Douglass's papers, speeches, and autobiographies have ensured that his legacy is not simply a matter of memory, but of living dialogue. Archives and digital collections make his words widely accessible, inviting each new generation to grapple with the questions he raised about freedom, equality, and the obligations of citizenship. The struggle for justice, Douglass knew, was not the work of a single lifetime. He saw himself as both a witness to history and a participant in its making. A man forged in the fires of slavery who rose to challenge the nation to become its best self. As the final chapters of his life unfolded, Douglass remained restless, never content with half measures or easy assurances. He understood, perhaps better than most, that the arc of history bends only when pressed by those who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. His life, from bondage to statesmanship, stands as both a rebuke to complacency and a beacon of hope. The work to which he devoted himself toward equality, toward justice, remains unfinished, but his example endures, inviting all who follow to take up the struggle anew.